Hey y'all, this is Zach Wright with Marzocco Home, and today we're going to talk about portafilter baskets. You might have noticed that when you received your machine, that your machine came with a whole suite of different size portafilter baskets. You've got your 21 gram, your 17 gram, 14 gram, and then the lesser used 7 gram basket. We're going to talk about maybe when to use each individual basket, and also when to swap them out based on your preference as well. So how do you decide which size portafilter basket to use? Oftentimes, you're gonna buy a bag of coffee and a roaster is gonna provide a set of parameters to brew that espresso at, what tastes delicious. So this month, we're featuring Onyx Coffee Lab for the Marzocco Home Espresso subscription. We're gonna start off just by simply using the Southern Weather blend that they are shipping to all of our subscribers as a starting point. The suggested recipe for the Southern Weather blend is starting at 20 grams of ground espresso in, and they recommend 50 grams of espresso out in about 25 seconds. So we're gonna go ahead and grind 20 grams into the 21 gram basket. And real quick, before we do that, each basket does dictate how much coffee you need to dose. So we're gonna use the 21 gram basket because they suggest dosing 20 grams. Each basket has a tolerance of plus or minus about 1.5 grams of coffee. So in this circumstance, we're using the 21 gram basket because we want to dose 20 grams. So let's go ahead and start grinding some coffee. So again, we used a 21 gram basket for this espresso because we dosed 20 grams of coffee in. But let's say you buy a bag of espresso and the roaster recommends 18 grams. In that circumstance, we'd want to use the 17 gram basket because again, it's within that tolerance of about 1.5 grams of the basket size itself. Now that's the most common way to pick your basket for your portafilter. Is based on the dose of the coffee that is suggested by the roaster within the recipe. But what happens if in this circumstance, maybe it's too much coffee for your preference? What do you do? Well, you could simply just pick a smaller basket and follow the same guidelines or the same brew ratio of that particular coffee. So in this circumstance, Onyx suggests 20 grams in, 50 grams out. It's a 1 to 2.5 brew ratio. So if you were to pick the 14 gram basket and dose, say, 15 grams, in order to keep that same brew ratio, you could do 15 grams of espresso in and about 37 or 38 grams out, and it's gonna fall within that same brew ratio. Yeah, and you can follow that math down the size of each basket, as long as you keep that brew ratio in mind. This coffee's really good at a 1 to 2.5 brew ratio, so if you change the volume of espresso in, the dose of espresso in, as long as you keep that output the same accordingly, it's going to be pretty dang delicious. Now there are some other things to keep in mind if you do reduce the dose of espresso in for any given coffee. Since we're using the 21 gram basket at the moment, that's the largest basket that we can use for one of our machines. But if you reduce the amount of coffee in, that is less restriction from the machine, and you're still applying the same temperature typically and the same pressure. So something kind of has to change. You have less restriction. Now typically, what that means is each basket actually requires a little bit less time to brew the espresso to taste to that same point of delicious or same point of extraction. Now, the best thing about this is that these are just guidelines. They're not hard, fast rules, right? Of course, there's a suggested recipe, but your preference really is the most important thing when it comes to this. Now, for me, my ideal espresso, I'm usually sticking with the 17 gram basket, and I like to pull like a lungo style shot, so a much bigger brew ratio. So if I'm dosing, say, 18 grams in, I really like espresso with about 50 grams, 60 grams sometimes of espresso out. Now that may seem a little off because I'm just picking a recipe, but you're able to tweak the variables around the machine in order to achieve your ideal espresso as well. Again, these are just guidelines, but your preference is also achievable just by having some more understanding of the variables around them. Now, keep in mind, again, just to summarize, the baskets determine how much coffee you can dose in. But what happens if you have a preferred brew ratio or a preferred style of espresso? What do you do in that circumstance? You can actually pick any basket realistically that you want. For me, personally, I'm always using the 17 gram basket. I very, very rarely change. And my ideal espresso is dosing about 18 grams in to around 50 grams out as well. I like a more voluminous shot, something to sip on like an Americano. But let's say maybe you like something a little bit more viscous, with a lot of viscosity. You know, you could theoretically take a 17 gram basket and dose 18 grams in and yield about 18 grams out as well. Let's say you have a bunch of friends coming over to your house and you want to serve them all espresso. The 21 gram basket in that circumstance is super great because you can dose a larger amount of coffee and you can yield a lot more espresso. So if you're making drinks back to back to back, you can split it kind of like what you saw earlier. Now, what if you're making coffee for yourself and that's too much? You could use a smaller basket. You could decrease the amount of espresso that you're dosing in and of course decrease the amount of espresso out that you're drinking. Something we've been experimenting at Marzocco Home that you might be interested in trying is if you've been brewing with a 17 gram or a 21 gram basket at home and you find yourself wanting something a little bit smaller, you could simply just swap to the 7 gram basket without really making any adjustment to the grind size itself, but still apply the same brew ratio and brew the espresso and see how it turns out. We found that by swapping it, everything actually works pretty close to the same as both of the larger baskets and have been pretty delicious. You may notice too that the 7 gram basket compared to the other baskets has a little bit different of a shape. Inside, you can see this little beveled edge that goes into the actual holes similar to the other baskets as well. And what we've found is that provides a bit more restriction, similar to more coffee being dispersed and spread out in a larger size diameter, like in the 17, 21 gram and the 14 gram baskets as well. So that restriction kind of chokes up the process a little bit, and that's what we're thinking as what provides the restriction to allow your grind size to stay the same. Most of us do tend to stick with a portafilter basket. We find our ideal basket and we stick with it. Every morning we have our routines. I'm sure you do as well. But if you do find yourself wanting to switch things up or just kind of experiment a little bit, hopefully this has given you some guidance to do so. But of course, if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can find us at home.usa@lamarzocco.com. Send us your questions, send us your thoughts. We're happy to chat. Thanks. Please don't talk about me when I'm gone. Oh honey, though our friendship's